Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Welcome everyone to Balkan Circle. My name is Mary Neuberger, and I'm the director for the Center for Russian East European and Eurasian Studies and a professor of history here at UT Austin. My co-host, Kirill Abramov, is late today, but he will be rolling in, and we have an in-person kind of room here watching here at UT Austin. So that's exciting. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Asya Metodieva, who is a researcher at the Institute of International Relations in Prague, in Czechia, or Czech Republic, which I still call it. She completed her PhD at Central European University. In her dissertation, she focused on the mobilization and recruitment strategies of Islamist foreign fighters in the Balkans. Her book on this topic was published by Routledge in 2023. Asya's broader research interests include extremism, polarization, and disinformation campaigns. Asya analyzes political developments in Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans. She is currently involved in a project on digital sovereignty in Central Europe. Previously, she was a fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States in 2024, Visegrad Insight in 2020, and LSE Ideas in 2018. She also carried out a research visit at the University of Oxford. So we are excited to have her today speaking on affect and diplomacy, new and old friendships under pressure from conflict in Europe. Kirill's here now. I've already introduced her, so you're
Sorry about that.
you're off the hook. All right, Asya, we're excited to hear your talk today, so you can take it away.
Thank you so much for this very kind introduction and also for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to meet you all, even virtually. Today I'm not going to speak about extremism in the Balkans, which was my original topic during my PhD studies, but I would like to share with you the findings from a paper that deals with Serbia's foreign policy in the context of the Russo-Ukrainian war. The paper has been accepted, fortunately, in the beginning of September, and it's going to be published with the Southeast European and Black Sea Studies Journal, hopefully later this year. I will keep my talk within 30-40 minutes, at least this is what I know from the initial instructions, and of course I'll be happy to engage in discussion after that and answer your questions and hopefully hear your feedback. I would like to start maybe by sharing my slides. I think we don't have them shared yet, but yes, please let me know if you can see them.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. As I mentioned, the paper deals with Serbia's foreign policy. The title we've chosen with my co-author, Jacqueline Dufala, is Affect and Diplomacy, New and Old Friendships Under Pressure from the Conflict in Europe. I would like to maybe start with a few introductory words that what we had as an initial idea is that loyalties and friendships are usually challenged in times of crisis. They're either reaffirmed or redefined, and therefore we were wondering what happens with countries and their diplomatic strategies, countries that are usually trying to balance between Russia and the West, between the EU, their desire to become a member state, and on the other hand, with their affective friendships. The way I structured today's talk is to say a few words first about our conceptual framework, which deals with foreign policy and populism, and then to discuss the pressure points, namely the war in Ukraine. And as I mentioned already, our case study is Serbia, and in the context of the war on one hand, but on the other hand, its aspiration to join the European Union. I mentioned some of the questions already, but here is a list of our brainstorming before starting the paper. When the war broke out, Serbia, along with other European countries that don't have like very established foreign policy that aligns with the EU, brought a lot of questions to foreign policy discussions in Europe. So part of the questions that this paper tries to address are why is there a difference in how countries approach each other? What do these differences look like, especially in times of war? How does affect play a part in balancing during a moment of crisis? And when we talk about specifically about the case of Serbia, what happens? What's the approach of Serbia towards the EU on one hand and towards Russia diplomatically, and how can we read this? Now, focusing on populism, we decided to speak about emotions, the affective dimension of populism. When we think of, let's say, the moment of war, we imagine that the affective dimension is something that still exists and is still used, despite the fact that countries are trying to become more pragmatic, more interest-oriented. And the question is, what characteristics of this dimension are, and how do they manifest in times of a political crisis in the international system? While with the EU, Serbia, as you know, is more pragmatic, and its rhetoric is more prosaic. With Russia, there is a clear emotional dimension. And we wanted to focus on exactly this emotional dimension and to see how it manifests and whether it changes. So to maybe structure the questions around which we organize the research, what happens when affective relationships are put under pressure? Are they more or less durable? And what is underneath of these affective relationships? Foreign policy doesn't happen in vacuum, as we know, and therefore changes to these affective relationships can actually have effect on the balancing act. That was our main hypothesis. As I mentioned, we wanted to take the specific aspect of emotion and affect, and we relied on Chantal Mouffe's definition of affect. And she claims that affect plays a crucial role in the construction of political identities in particular. And following this, we examined affect in foreign policy during times of the war in Ukraine, specifically on the first 6 months of the war. By passions, Mouffe designates a certain type of common affects, those that are mobilized in the political domain in the formation of the we and they forms of identification. And because this we and they distinction can change over time, this also means that affect can be fluid. And where, like, if they changes in a particular political situation, this means that we can also change. In other words, affect is not static, and the way we study it in the case of Serbia is not static. It's not top-down concept, but it's influenced by interactions between states on the international level. And because Chantal Mouffe applies this framework to domestic politics and domestic forms of populism, our initial puzzle was whether this framework can also be applied to the international system. Therefore, we decided to talk about new and old friendships in the way we use this framework. And to define all the new friendships, we take the lens of affect. From previous research of Simon Kossuth and Andrea Olsner, we take this distinction between strategic and normative friendships in international relations. A strategic friendship is based on rational self-interest, despite verbalizing the existence of a friendship. A normative friendship is based on ideational and emotional bonds that permit mutual identification and trust. It is not based on rational cost-benefit analysis, or at least not only. But one thing that we added is that material conditions still matter in the way we define normative friendships. And the other addition that we have is the temporal element, the temporal dimension, to be able to construct these two concepts and distinguish between new and old friendships. Because the EU is a relatively new actor compared to Russia, we consider this a new friendship. And the new friendship is less likely to have an affective dimension, as it takes time to build common trust and a common sense of identification. However, of course, there can be affective elements, but these affective elements fall more under what we see here as material conditions that give the potential for an affective relationship in the future. So the relationship between countries in the Western Balkans, as we know, and between Western Balkans on one hand and the EU are largely defined by transactional or functional features. The promise of the EU membership additionally provides an economic incentive and thus a strategic rationale for joining the EU. The EU already has proven itself to be a strong economic partner, and while most Serbs believe that Russia and China are the largest donors to Serbia, it is in fact the EU. And therefore, there is a clear strategic element to the Serbia-EU relationship. However, the EU is also a symbolic space that has both the promise of membership, but also it also has a constructed way of attaining this membership, the language of European values, understood as liberal democratic values, is an appeal to a normative order that is, at least to some degree, constructed around common culture. So for Serbia to join the EU and for this prospect to remain open, Serbia must show that it follows most of these shared values and cultural similarities. To show here is imperative word because since membership and good relations are predicated on making this connection, rhetoric in this space can be seen as much more purposefully performative. Yet these affective elements are seen more as a basis of building a normative friendship and than illustrating an existing one. In other words, Serbia's role is not to construct its identity and present it to the EU, but to perform an identity to the EU that is seen as a European. Now, what complicates this whole conversation about what's the nature of the friendship between the EU and Serbia based on values are cases like Hungary or until recently Poland or Bulgaria. In other words, member states which challenge in many ways the assumption that they have aligned with the stated European values. This is about new friendships, but new friendships are contrasted with old friendships. And this is how we define the friendship of Serbia with Russia. As you can see also from the slide, an old friendship primarily has elements of normative friendship, where there are long-standing ties, typically based on history and shared values. There are elements of trust. There are also elements of forgiveness. when we talk about foreign policy. There may be strategic elements within the friendship, yet typically affective elements are more commonly referred to in the political discourse that we studied. And while normative friendships may be perceived as being strong, there is an additional possibility that because they are strong, they may be also taken for granted in certain situations. This means that an actor may feel they can favor another state with whom they have a new friendship instead of the old friendship. So we're going to go in the next slides to the more empirical and more easily how to say understandable definition of friendship when it comes to Serbia between the EU and Russia. But I would like to point that certain elements of Russia and Serbia's relationship can be classified, in fact, as markers of this old friendship. And I believe that all of you are familiar with the rhetoric related to Slavic heritage, Orthodox values, and while such identity and historical ties may play a rather secondary role in foreign policy, they have a role in creating and maintaining collective memories, as well as creating space for attachments to values in times of international crisis. And now, why the case of Serbia? As I explained in the beginning, for us, it was particularly curious that Serbia had a hard time to find its place in the first months of the war. The political discourse was extremely interesting, trying to keep the pre-existing balance that has been in place for years, but on the other hand, also trying to adjust to the new geopolitical situation. Serbia has been, and the political establishment in Serbia has been trying to balance its geopolitics and its economic dependencies on both the EU and Russia. But as I said, with the outbreak of the war, globally countries have taken sides regarding the conflict, but it was difficult for countries that were having this balancing act in their foreign policy. And Serbia indeed has found itself in a difficult position. Its approach towards its external relations has hardly been, I would say, direct and standard. On the one hand, there are pro-EU sentiments that typically are driven by or framed by more economic concerns. And on the other hand, there are more affective elements in Serbia-Russian relations, with Russia often being shown as the old friend, very often, like a phrase very often used by the political establishment in Serbia. Serbia's foreign policy up to this point, as I said, is a strong example of a balancing act between Russia and the EU. And this rivalry between Russia and the EU was exploited to maintain its domestic control and maximize political and economic benefits for years. It stopped short of posing a direct normative challenge to existing EU standards. And the Serbian establishment has been seeking to balance domestic and foreign policy interests, and as I said, to maximize not only benefits but also pro-Western and pro-Russian Serbian voices and votes internally. But the war challenged this delicate balance that Serbia has been maintaining, and the affective dimension of Serbia's government has created possibilities for the government to maneuver its relationship with Russia and the EU in a new way. So we argue that it was strategy rather than ideology that shaped, in this case, what we define as populist countries' foreign policy. which illustrates that a crisis provides an opportunity for changes. I wouldn't say in the foreign policy per se, but at least in the way politicians speak about international relations. So there was a change in the political discourse. As I mentioned, we analyzed political speeches from the first 6 months of the war. We focused on political speeches of Aleksandar Vučić. Why? Because he represents, let's say, the voice of the government, despite having stronger pro-Russian voices and stronger pro-Western voices in Serbia. We chose that he is the one who was conveying messages to the international audience in these days. So while the EU and Serbia have a more strategic approach to their relations, as I mentioned, all ties like Serbia are more affective, and in the public discourse, Serbia's relationship with Russia is often seen through this prism of friendship and fraternal ties. There is almost mythologization of historical experiences, of solidarity, of pan-Slavic ideas, of strong national emotions. But on the other hand, the relationship with the EU is rationalized, emotionless, and seen as a question of strategic interest and not necessarily values. So the way we conducted the analysis, we focused on we analyzed the speeches using thematic analysis, and we called it themes that appeared across different speeches. And the 3 topics that dominated the political speeches we analyzed were Russia, the European path, defined as a strategic choice, and Kosovo as a variable that connects, provides bridge between domestic politics, domestic audiences, and foreign policy messages. I think I will spend a little bit on each of these topics. I think we still have maybe around 10 minutes, and then we can focus on questions. So how does Russia appear in Vučić's speeches? The most important is that, and that's rather a general impression before giving you more information about the analysis itself. It was inconvenient for Serbia to express its affective friendship with Russia. The war made it inconvenient to the extent that Serbia is, as a candidate member state of the EU, is expected to at least a certain degree align its foreign policy with the EU. So this inconvenience to express emotions towards Russia was manifested again in the first months. Now the picture is very different. But historically, we know that Russia has been used in Serbia's discourse to show that Serbia has alternatives, to show the West that if you don't like us, if you don't accept us in your let's say wealthy clubs, and we don't belong there, we have alternatives. Serbia's political elite emphasizes that these alternatives can be easily achieved. They are based on trust, on friendships that are pre-existing. And this is especially the case with Russia. There is also an emphasis of historical ties, and also these historical ties are very often connected to the fact that Russia is portrayed as Serbia's protector, particularly on issues related to Kosovo's independence. Now, what we saw with the outbreak of the war was that unlike the EU countries, the majority of EU countries, Serbia delayed its response to the common sanctions policy that the EU came up with. So there was a delay of a few days before Aleksandar Vučić delivered his first speech, declaring what Serbia's stance would be on this. And this already showed the hesitation of the country in this particular situation. So the balancing act was already challenged. Vučić emphasizes Serbia's respect for Ukraine's territorial integrity, but what we saw a few days later is that there was a refusal to join the sanctions against Russia. And in this situation, the justification for having a friendship with Russia was necessary. Until the war in Ukraine, there was no such a need to justify why we have this pre-existing or these strong historical ties. It was in a way self-evident in the way Vučić was speaking about Russia. But with the outbreak of the war, there was need for additional justification. And the way this was done was by saying that Russia is a longtime ally, recalling that Russia's support for Serbia was very strong during the 90s. There were no sanctions imposed by Russia, but again, this is part of the political rhetoric, not the factual picture. But there was also element of to justify this relationship, to say that there is a national interest, but also tradition. The friendship with Russia is framed as a core element of Serbia's national interest. And when this rhetoric was challenged by the war, we saw that the rhetoric became less emotional, more sober, and more connected to the idea of normativity, of having these strong ties. But now it's not time to think about our emotions. We have to be rational. We have to be thinking about our national interests. So taking the diplomatic pragmatism as a main approach, there is this interesting quote. I didn't put it in the slides, but Vučić refers to Churchill's idea of no friends forever, or enemies, but their permanent interests, emphasizing that Serbia's need to avoid conflict with major powers, therefore to keep the balancing act, but still not in an effective way. This is the topic, or let's say the frames that appear in relation to Russia. Now moving to the European path. As I mentioned, the relationship or the rhetoric towards the EU has been rather pragmatic. But with the pressure coming from the EU to align its foreign policy, Serbia had to also make sure that it conveys messages related to values, related to a real friendship, because this was this is the path during a crisis. It's the only alternative. Multiple times he repeats in press conferences or in interviews he gave in the first months of the war that the European path has no alternative. Now, interestingly, this is also combined with a very strong sense of victimhood when it comes to the West. And it also shows the complex relationship that Serbia has with the West. On one hand, the EU is the only way forward. On the other hand, Serbia's victimhood that goes back to the 1990s NATO bombings portrays Serbia as a victim of inconsistent West. Moreover, Aleksandar Vučić blames the West for standing and supporting Ukraine in such a unified and strong manner, whereas in the past, Serbia, despite in his words, did not did not betray any international law commitments, was attacked, and the West was the one to blame. So this complexity is difficult because Vučić and Serbia are in a situation, or they're in need to convey very clear messages that Russia is not the friend that we have to stick to right now. But on the other hand, domestically, he cannot entirely forget or not rely on narratives related to this victimhood that has been used throughout the years. And I will probably, I will say a few words about Kosovo, because this is a topic that defines the relationship both with Russia and with the West and the EU in particular. I put a quote here that I think illustrates very much this victimhood that I talked about. I don't see the full screen, but I believe that each of you can see it. President Biden said that Russia shamelessly committed an act on a sovereign attack on a sovereign country. You know how much I respect President Biden. I would have taken these words very seriously if I had not been an approach more than shameless towards Serbia in '99. And do not forget that there was a big difference. Serbia was attacked, although did not attack any other sovereign state. So as you can see, this victimhood related to Kosovo is very strong. It defines both the relationship with Russia and the West. Kosovo is a central topic to Serbia's identity and its emotional connection to historical heritage. And it's framed as a symbol of Serbia's struggle and emotional victimization, especially regarding its history with the West and NATO. And while Russia is portrayed as a protector, there was a moment when we observed a shift in the discourse. I don't know how many of you remember the words of Vladimir Putin when he referred to the case of Kosovo. Actually, it happened on multiple occasions. Russia basically referred to Kosovo as a precedent to justify its actions in Ukraine. And this created tensions in Serbia. It created discursive tensions, causing fears of losing Russia's support in relation to Kosovo. Putin's reference to Kosovo challenged Serbia's narrative of Russia being a consistent ally, being an old friend, a reliable one, the one that can be trusted. This Kosovo theme is used to justify on multiple occasions Serbia's non-compliance with the EU sanctions on Russia, as I mentioned. But on the other hand, when this discursive challenge appeared, there was an emotional withdrawal. And in this moment, Vučić had to use more emotionless discourse in order to basically protect what he defines as national interests, and in a way to navigate between the emotional bonds that the country has with Russia and the strategic interests with the EU. This we define as a crisis in an old friendship. So Russia's stance on Kosovo during the Ukrainian war has created a crisis that it's not impossible to overcome, but it can only be overcome because there is a sense of forgiveness, there is a sense of trust, there are emotions attached to this foreign policy friendship. And in this introduction of nuances in relation to Russia, it is evident that affect is constrained. Affect used by populists is constrained under the pressure of international crisis. And this was our main finding. And I will maybe stop here because I'm close to 40 minutes to summarize everything that I talked about in a few key findings. So while Serbia's affective dimension with Russia simmers, its strategic discourse towards the EU remains. The populist appeal that is very easily constructed around affect, and it relies very much on affect. It is constrained during political crisis, international crisis, and priority is given to strategic aspects of political friendships, either old friendships or new friendships, but it's about strategic aspects, not that much about ideology. Serbia had affective ties with Russia that were changed from the Russia-Ukraine war, but this is something that we can say within the given time frame of the first 6 months. And it's rather analysis of the discourse, not the change of the foreign policy. Nevertheless, discourse creates spaces of acceptance, both from the public, but also internationally, or non-acceptance, that, in our opinion, may lead to shifts to foreign policy changes in the long run. I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. That was fantastic. I took a lot of notes. I was like, ooh, I have a lot of questions. Not sure if I should just turn on my screen.
Hang on, I'm waiting for this to.
Okay. Well, this is the time first.
Oh, you gotta mute yourself.
Sorry, I'm muting. First of all, I would like to apologize to Asya, Dobro večer, izvinjavajte mnogo. And to my co-host, Dr. Newberger. I was caught in my undergrad lecture. However, I would like to thank you for this wonderful opportunity to think and engage with a rather important topic for European but also global politics. Due to the fact that I agree with you, you pointed out some important features of, say, Russian foreign policy that always pivot around the question of Kosovo by justifying current actions and so on. And if you allow me, as a political scientist, I'm very curious about several sort of questions, which I will start with, and they're methodological in order for me just to get a better grip and understanding, on the conclusions, which I agree with. But I wanted just to ask you, my first question, Asya, is what is the size of the sample that you guys were looking at? So how large is the data set? That is one. My understanding is that the data set was constructed following the idea of Chantal Mouffe. So if memory serves me right, this is both structuralist, both Marxist approach, for looking at discursive, employing discursive analysis in order to measure effect. So am I correct to understand, that's my second question, that you're measuring effect as manifested in discourse that appears in sort of meta themes that you have grouped in three? And if that's so, here's my question number 4, I guess. I saw that you do have a whole section on Kosovo, but then looking at the time frame of your data gathering, I assume, because I saw 22, some of the samples that you were using as exemplars. Why have you made a decision to not include, say, Republika Srpska or any other relevant events? Because there is also another dimension, important, which might be there. I just probably haven't heard it. And this is the military security dimension in this transactional and strategic, as you call it, relationship with the Russian state. thank you. I know it's a lot, but I think that will put this kind of like into the context, I suppose.
Thank you. Thank you for these questions. Yes, about the data set first, we focused on the key speeches of Aleksandar Vučić. So we went through, of course, a bigger number of speeches, and we pre-selected those that make sense in terms of like having more of the messages related to the war. I would say that we had, I think, 20, between like 18 and 20 speeches at the end. Some of them were press conferences, delivered in the presence of EU politicians. Some of them were for domestic audience. I think one or two were part of a political campaign because Serbia also had its elections right after the outbreak of the war. So we try to actually limit the sample for the reason that we try to work on the paper rather fast, or let's say, because the thing is that empirical material is coming up every day, and we had to draw the line and stop somewhere and just say, all right, so let's take this sample and see what happens, or take a snapshot in terms of time frame and analyze it. We are extending the research at the moment using the same framework, and we are extending it actually to include two other case studies, namely area, and to see how this framework of like old and new friendships can does it produce the same outcomes. So this was our. Mhm.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. Could you please just repeat, because there was a break?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. Well, you said two other cases and it just on our end cut
Right,
and
right.
we didn't hear what are the cases.
So we are currently extending the research, focusing on two other cases, namely Hungary and Bulgaria, to understand better whether this balancing act has been affected by the war, and this complex relationships that the two countries navigate, to what extent they are similar or different from the case of Serbia. It is an interesting point to extend it to Republika Srpska and military strategic dimension. It's something that's missing. And it was purely a decision to be like, okay, let's stop and see what we have and be able to engage with empirical data before collecting more. So, but I agree that there's certainly more nuances to be taken into consideration.
Thank you very much, Asya, and sorry for this, but we couldn't hear. So thank you for clarifying, because this puts us into the opportunity to start, the discussion. I think that methodology, from our perspective, is important because when you do the sample, and we all know, how we approach, timelines, whether, we can actually compare, because certain things will affect, the very fact that certain things are within. When you talk about populism in general, what comes to my mind, from, some of the classic authors, and I saw that you have Tagger, that you're using, but whether it's in electoral contest, context, or outside of it, whether it is the regular rhetoric, so it does matter, right? And how big are the texts that you're breaking down, and then you're coding and you're analyzing. This is all, Mary, maybe your questions, or I saw that my colleague,
I'll start
Professor
with one.
Steele. Yes.
I'll start with one. Okay. Well, thank you for this talk. It's really exciting to see someone thinking about diplomatic questions with this kind of nuance, and with looking at things like understanding cultural ties and affect and things like this, because I think that's often left out. So I'm really excited about that. So my question is about, it seems to me there was a lot of focus on affect in relationship to Russia in terms of positive ties and affect. But as you kind of brought up, but then I think we could talk more about, there's a lot of affect towards Europe, I think both positive and negative. Both in terms of, wanting to return to Europe, or this idea of we are European. I would imagine among different generations as well, there's different kinds of sort of ties and affect to Europe. But I was thinking more in terms of negative affect towards Europe and how important that is, like deep ambivalence towards Europe that goes back earlier than the 90s, but the notion of Europe as an actor, because you talked about the EU as a new actor, but I think that EU is also becomes a kind of avatar for earlier Europe in the West as being an inconsistent kind of supporter of Serbia, but also in pure pragmatic terms as being an economic at times liability. Not always being helpful, being, sort of colonizing in a way, like setting up economic relationships that are not necessarily helpful. And so particularly in looking at the sort of Eurosceptic East European countries later additions to the EU and their own economic woes, which of course they also benefited from being part of the EU, but are also deeply ambivalent towards those economic relationships right now. And I'm thinking about the recent protests last year, particularly farmers protesting the new cap policies and regulations that are really difficult for them to put in place. And also particularly protesting imports from Ukraine that were being allowed and the pressure from the EU to make that happen. So, in other words, can we also look at affect as a negative force coming from sort of deeper ambivalences towards Europe? As I would say equally powerful in a way and acting in different kind of forms instead of Russian affect towards Russia.
I would say that, thank you very much, Mary, for this question. I would say that we see this manifestation of, or this use of affect in this particular way more in Hungary than in the case of Serbia, in a very effective way, because affect is part of the populist repertoire, and we see for like how it's done systematically in Hungary, combined with the idea of return to Europe, where the EU is not anymore the promise. There is no promise of membership. This goal is achieved already, but there is this attachment to values. So in the Hungarian case, this is also like why the relationship with the EU is so complex, because the political rhetoric when it comes to the EU is very negative. Brussels is trying to control us and like tell us what to do internally and domestically and all this. But when it comes to values, actually it is this return to Europe that it's more, it provides the affective, the positive affective dimension in the relationship with the EU. Unlike Hungary, I would say that in Serbia, there is this distinction when it comes to, there is no sense of return to Europe. Serbia is seen as fundamentally different. Serbia is it's a country that identifies itself much more with Russia, with the sense of orthodoxy, with also through this idea of victimhood and rejection by the EU. The inconsistency in the EU approach towards Serbia and the Western Balkans, that has been also used as a instrument in the political rhetoric, is muted in the first 6 months of the war. Now it's coming back to a certain extent in given situations. Of course, it depends very much who the government talks to. So when EU politicians are visiting, the narrative is very positive. When it comes to, let's say, Kosovo and domestic audiences, the EU becomes again, I wouldn't say an enemy, but certainly this inconsistency is more emphasized. And this is why I think it's very interesting to study these countries comparatively, because it reveals that populists use affect differently. But these actors, the international actors, although being the same 2-3 actors, the relationships with them are managed very individually, depending on the national interests.
Yeah, it seemed, thank you for that answer. I was thinking it also obviously changes over time. It depends on which actors you're listening to. I mean, there's a lot of performative aspect of speeches of leaders, but you know, you might find a lot more in the popular press. Colorful language in different directions, so.
But I would
Yes,
say
yeah.
that affect as a strategy in the case of Hungary uses or employs much more the negativity or the sense of EU as an enemy, whereas the inconsistency of the EU is stressed in the Serbian case, but certainly the EU is not portrayed as an enemy, because this is a strategic choice and the only path when it comes to economic and strategic development.
Right, and when you're not in yet, you have to
Mhm.
mute certain concerns.
Tame
Once you're in.
Hold yourself.
All bets are off, yeah.
So I'll leave myself on mute and thank you, Asya, for a really interesting talk. Historically have had a lot of questions since I was a graduate student and problems with Chantal Mouffe and Lachlau. And I think that you share a few of the concerns, at least judging from what you've written and how you've critiqued Mouffe. I find Mouffe still interesting to read, like in her understanding of Carl Schmitt. And I don't want to get all the way into the theory, but I think, as a scholar who's now in her 80s, she has a certain group of people who read her and select and sometimes over-select ideas. I'm particularly interested in her blind spots. So Ukraine is, in my estimation, one of them, or say Latin American left populist movements. I find it interesting that she was sought after by Podemos and by Corbyn as a consultant, and we all know what's happened to Corbyn in his role in the Labour Party. So, just in the world of theory, I think if you want to comment about that, fine, but I think it's important to remember where Mouffe's audiences are. And that leads to the second question, which is really about Serbia as a market. So I think about the memorandum of understanding that the EU and Serbia signed, I think it was in the summer back in June or July, just sort of like for what Serbia produces, that battery value chains and like raw materials and some environmental things, electric vehicles. But obviously Ukrainians need Serbia too. And this is one of the untold stories of the war, that Ukrainians are consistently getting weapons from Serbia and they're getting drones in particular, and the parts for drones from Serbia on the black market, and for defense in particular. So I'm thinking, not just about like sort of this level of high political elites, what Vučić is doing, what he thinks about Kosovo and so forth, or Bosnia for that matter, but what Serbia is targeted as. And I wonder the extent to which you see maybe convergences or divergences between strong civil societies and weak civil societies. I still consider Ukraine, for better or worse, under martial law, to be a strong civil society. And the different appeals, or at least the different reaches into the Balkans that Ukrainians are making towards Serbia are going to be a really important part going forward in the fall and spring, especially after the US election, to see like the weapons transfers that are coming from Serbia to Ukraine. So I wonder, in looking at effect, not just from that high kind of ivory tower or like Mearsheimer type of level, if you might talk about that in the applications that you're writing about for the Balkans.
Thank you. This is extremely interesting, and I share some of the how to say the criticisms, and like we try to engage with Moufe's framework to the extent that it can help us define how we understand emotions in this particular context, because emotions in IR are studied from very, very different angles, looking at emotions of political actors or used as a tool to achieve certain political goal. We were trying to find our definition in terms of what is it that we would like to understand about Serbia's diplomatic strategy in a situation of a crisis. So this identity, the link between identity and affect was the part of Mouffel's framework that we found useful in terms of being able to see if your political identity or your values or your ideology is challenged by international crisis. How do you respond to this? And like, to what extent you move from what you were yesterday in relation to other political actors. So given this, we also saw a lot of gaps that we try to address by engaging with this framework of strategic friendships versus normative, and to add the temporality as an element. So these were kind of our ways to improve what's there already. And it was our lens, not for any, how to say, ideological reasons, but it was purely the need to see what we need. It was, this was our approach. Now, if I understand correctly, your second question, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is about moving affect from the political level to the societal level.
Material, yeah, I would say, this is also one of Mouffel's blind spots, so like the materiality of things.
Yes.
And especially Serbia as a market. So not just what political elites are saying, but what Serbia is positioning itself for and being used for.
In our reading, it is indeed, I agree that it's a blind spot. So the way we solved or try to solve this is by adding the necessity or the essential element of material conditions. So that material conditions can be actually part of both old and new friendships. It is not like old friendships are not entirely based on affect, but affect also permits for material conditions to be present and to be exploited in particular situations. So what we see from our empirics is that the emphasis on material conditions in relation to Russia, it's stronger than it was before. Before the war, it was easier to talk about fraternal ties and orthodoxy and all this, whereas with the outbreak of the war, it was easier to say, well, the Russian gas, it's about a matter of survival for us. Now, we haven't studied how this is manifested in relation to Ukraine, and like whether these material conditions and affect actually are linked in the discourse about Ukraine. But I would say that in many ways, these gaps that we try to address helped us to understand this maneuvering that Serbia has been applying in the first months, but it also continues to apply. Now, strong civil society and weak civil society is certainly like an idea I would like to explore more. I don't think that I have an answer to this question, but like I took a note because I think that this is going to help us enormously with the other two empirical cases. With Hungary, Hungary in particular, Bulgaria to a certain extent, but this is I'm very grateful for this. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Christian, did you have a question?
Yeah. Actually, hi, Asya, nice to meet you. I'm Christian Atanasov. I'm Fulbrighter, currently Fulbrighter here at the University of Austin. So, first, congratulations for the very interesting lecture. I just wondering, because actually you answered to some of my previous question, which I thought to ask you, but what actually are the current expectation in Serbia about the result of the war in Ukraine? Because if I'm able to compare the expectations in Bulgaria, they are, according to me, very well summarized by one Bulgarian intellectual who I'm like very much. So who has noticed very strange trends between the demontage of the monument of the Soviet Army in the center of Sofia and the trends in the war in Ukraine. So while the Ukrainians are advancing, the demontage continued in, how to say, manner. And opposite of that, while the Russian are trying to advance, the monument is back. I mean, yeah. Because it's very important to know what are the expectations about the result of the war. Because if I just to share that, once the war started, I was really scared because of the Russian propaganda. I think that the Russians will land into a center of Kiev with some kind of the spaceship or something like that. So what are the expectations?
Thank you for this question. So there are three elements. I mentioned some of this during the presentation, that there is this sense of strategic neutrality. So the prism or the lens of national interest, at least at the level of political discourse, is something that has been emphasized since the beginning of the war to this day. So the strategic neutrality means that to the extent possible and politically possible, Serbia has to comply with what is expected from the EU, meaning to at least speak about supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity, and like to make decisions based on its strategic intention or aspiration to join the EU. So from this point of view, the expectation is that the war will continue as long as we don't know how long it's going to continue, but that Serbia has to make sure that it balances and it stays within or in line with the EU. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that Serbia is worried that if Putin justifies his actions in Ukraine with or gives Kosovo as an example and precedent, this means that the pressure from the EU and from the West towards Serbia is going to increase, which is a very bad signal for Vučić and the establishment in Serbia. So this means that if we imagine a situation, of course, this is already about future scenarios about Ukraine, but if we have a situation in which, let's say, Ukraine is ready for negotiations, Russia is ready for negotiations, they sit and part of the territorial integrity of Ukraine is sacrificed, this is a very bad signal for Serbia, because Serbia has to make the tough decision that it has been postponing, namely the decision on Kosovo's independence. So these are key elements to how Serbia's expectation is constructed. And the third element is that Serbia is really hopeful to join this new world, brave new world led by Viktor Orban and Hungary, in which they're going to be the peacemakers. Because the Hungarian rhetoric at the moment is that we know how to there should be peace, this war has to end, and we would like to lead the situation in this direction. So there is this expectation that Serbia is also capable of conveying these foreign policy messages. But if you ask me about what is the expectation about the end of the war, I think that they're very mixed messages depending on which part of the political spectrum they come. So depending on the audience, depending on the situation, you would hear from politicians who are trying to encourage the far right and the pro-Russian sentiments in the society to language which is more supportive of the West in Ukraine.
Thank you, thank you.
There is one question.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
it's last, yeah, I hope. So Asya, thank you so much for your presentation. It's so nice. And for me, you know, it's like now I'm a little bit clear, understand the situation in Serbia, because I'm Ukrainian. And of course, like some my former Ukrainian students, like decided to choose like Serbia, you know, like residence for refugees, like to be refugees here. And when we was talking about, okay, like during our like practical classes or lecture, why like, you know, like why like you didn't use like Ukrainian when you answer on my question and something like that? And they told me, oh, I'm sorry, I'm sitting like in the center of like in Serbia, you know, in some town in the center of like mall, and a lot of like Russians here, a lot of like Serbian who support like Russians, and when they hear like some Ukrainian languages, so I'm a little bit afraid about it. It was maybe at the beginning of the like full scale invasion. Now situation it's a little bit changed, you know, and I every time couldn't understand why like Serbia, who gave her space, you know, for Ukrainian refugees, provided like such don't understandable, yeah, like misunderstandable like policy. And in this case, I have just one like question. So the situation in Serbia now, for me, for example, it's a little bit familiar to the situation in Ukraine in 90s. For example, you know, like 90s and the beginning of the like 2000 years. Why? Because like, okay, so we want to be like close to EU, but of course, Russian gas, you know, like every time. So if we have some like Russian or gaps, every time like we fill in these gaps about like Russian money, Russian gas, you know, like if like looking for the future, what do you think? It could be like in the, I don't know, like after like 20, 30, 40 years, maybe later, yeah? What do you think? Is it possible to repeat for Serbia scenario which Ukraine has today, like from Russia? So if Serbia, like, you know, like will not understand her like clear proclaim her international way, I don't know, like foreign affairs or something like that, you know, like it's like try to balance between like Russia and EU every time. So it means like, okay, sometimes you know, like something could be happened. Who knows? What do you think? Is it possible for Serbia to repeat the Ukrainian scenario like in the future?
That's a $10 million question. Thank you. Wow, I don't know if I don't think that I would be able to you know, give you a clear answer,
Okay,
because
I
this is
predict something. Okay. But
yes,
just you know, like what do you think?
I understand the nature of your question, and thank you, because it's very complex. So I think that Ukraine and Serbia are fundamentally different in many ways, and also in terms of their role in the regions which they represent. I think the question of the question of Kosovo for Serbia is the variable that is going to define in which direction Serbia is going to go. Whether now or in 40 years or in 50 or 60 years this is going to be solved is something that, in my view, nobody knows. It depends very much on the political establishment in Serbia, and also the desire of the EU to help and facilitate the resolution of this question. Because like your question is really complex because like I'm going to Brussels next week to talk about the EU enlargement in the Western Balkans. My question in response to your question is, does the EU really want Ukraine and Serbia in the EU?
Yeah, it's a good
So
question.
this whole conversation about you know, moving towards the West, moving towards Russia or China, it's about also like not only intentions and political rhetoric, but it's about what we see as tangible results. And the way the Western Balkans were promised EU membership is in the same romantic and beautiful way this membership is promised to Ukraine these days. I hope this is not too.
Got it.
I hope it's not too unpleasant, let's say, statement. But so I think that if the EU really wants the region to be integrated, if it wants Serbia to move towards the West in a more convincing manner, it has a lot of work to be done. And same with Ukraine. So I'm not convinced what the world is how the world is gonna look like in 40 years, but I still think that the similarity of both cases comes from the fact that there is a promise made to both of them, a promise that is not fulfilled, and I don't know for how long they're gonna be waiting.
Thank you.
Well, I guess the flip side of that though is if they enter, is it gonna be all they've hoped for? Or are their expectations gonna be dashed? As we've seen elsewhere in Eastern Europe where, you know, there's such deep Euroscepticism and many problems that are arguably caused by being part of the EU. Like migration and brain drain and other
Yes,
kinds of
it's an important question because I live in Czech Republic, and here the foreign policy discourse is, yes, we would like Western Balkans to join the EU. Yes, we would like Ukraine in the EU. However, we don't want internal reform within the EU. So there is no way that these two themes are connected in the foreign policy discourse. And then, as you said, the disappointment is inevitable because the geopolitical approach that the EU is taking right now towards the region is it's harmful in a way that it doesn't allow for deep and genuine reforms to be done. But on the other hand, deep and genuine reforms could have been done already if there was a mutual, how to say, desire for this process to move forward. Mentioning civil society multiple times, it happened throughout the years when Serbia was showing very strong civil society. However, there was no genuine support and let's say signaling from Brussels that this should be supported and encouraged further. So this stabilitocracy, as they call the regimes in the region, is it's an EU production. And I think as far as we are okay with it, it's hard to imagine that countries that are new members are going to be satisfied with the results. And let's not think about this as a top-down process, because there is agency of local governments that also have been living in this convenience between East and West, between Russia and the EU. And for Serbia, this is extremely convenient. I am not sure, I asked the question about the EU, but I'm also not sure if Serbia wants to join the EU, because receiving money and not complying with reforms is actually a very convenient political situation.
Well, thank you so much for this. There's a lot of questions that we can all think about more, and a lot of reading we can do of your wonderful work. So I hope everyone will get Asya's book and read this article, and we'll be following your future work. So stay in touch with us.
Thank you for
And
the invitation.
yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It was a real pleasure, and I hope that one day we can meet in person.
Благодаря много. Лека вечер.
Благодаря и аз. Лека вечер.
Лека вечер.